Thank you for coming tonight. This is our third installment of the Bath Climate Conversations series. Thank you for coming in person and thank you for joining us on Zoom. If you are tuning in from Zoom, you might notice that you can't see the other participants. That's because you're in a webinar, so you won't be able to see each other or talk to the presenter. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will relay them to the speaker during the Q&A portion at the end of the chat. That's all from me. Ruth is going to do a few things from the city. Go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you. So I'm presenting tonight with my Climate Action Commission hat on. So this is a joint presentation of the Kennebec-Estuary Land Trust, the library, and the city of Bath. It's the third climate conversation program. The first focused on bringing together local leaders who look at the built environment. The second focused on looking at the natural environment. And this is focused on Bath's waters and our vulnerability. So a quick introduction to the Climate Action Commission. It's a group that was formed. It's a formal city committee that is focused on supporting climate resilience in the city and figuring out ways to help the city advance different efforts to increase our resilience. And here's our team. We have an excellent group. So the Climate Action Commission has been in existence since 2019. And one exciting thing that we were able to spearhead and then get approved by the city council is a resolution that identifies a series of goals that the city is working towards and aligns the city's goals with the goals in the main weight climate action plan. So in the middle whereas here, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. Achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, and then these last two, which are tied to sea level rise. So committing to manage for sea level rise of 1.5 feet by 2050 and 3.9 feet by 2100, and then preparing to manage for those higher levels by 2050 and 2100. And that has a lot of waterfront, so it's a big piece of thinking about our city and the community going forward, trying to understand what does that actually look like in Bath? How do we deal with that? So highlighting those two pieces, and that's kind of, we'll start some of that conversation tonight and are looking forward to hearing your thoughts for the second part of the program tonight. So this is not the first time that people have been talking about climate and the flooding in downtown Bath. It's been, people have seen it during various storms. It's also been something that the city's been planning for a number of years. So there was a 2010 initial climate action plan. There was a 2011 forest and water climate adaptation plan. In 2013, there was a coastal adaptation to sea level rise report doing some initial sea level rise mapping. In 2014, that's what this map comes from. There was a team of architects that came and did some really neat visioning of what could Bath look like in a future where there's more water. And then in 2019, there was an update to the climate action plan. And the plan now, there was a 2022 plan focused on water pollution and sewer updates to deal with rising waters. So we've got this background of thinking about climate, but there's so much more that we can learn. And so this study that we're doing now and another effort that's going to be happening this summer with a Bowdoin student, they'll be doing a new assessment of Bath's emissions and where our emissions are coming from. So this is the first part. So the city is working towards a climate action plan, and what that includes a whole bunch of different pieces. But the first bit is understanding what are our risks, what are our vulnerabilities, where are we at now? And the second part of that is how do we address those things? And so this presentation tonight is going to talk about where are we at now? What are our future risks? And to get at that information, like I said, the Bowdoin student is going to be looking at emissions. But for this piece, we got a community resilience partnership grant from the state to fund a study looking at our flooding vulnerability, and ended up contracting with an engineering firm, GEI, thank you. My apologies.
That's okay.
We contracted with GEI, and they're starting to do this really detailed assessment that looks at flooding in Bass Waterfront in a much more detailed way, looking at duration, and you'll hear a lot more as the presentation goes on. So I'm going to turn it over to Leila, oh my goodness.
Hannah and I had this conversation. I would say Layla. It's Leila. Thank you. This was.
No, it's okay. Let me see if I can. This.
It's not, okay. Thank you, everybody. My name is Leila Pike. I am a civil engineer with GEI Consultants, and I've been hired by the city of Bath to work on this flood vulnerability analysis, and that is what I'm here to speak to you about tonight. So a little bit of background about myself. I grew up on Islesboro, also vulnerable to flooding. And now I live in Portland. And for the last 10 years or so, I have been doing a lot of work with coastal modeling, flood prediction in the state of Maine. I've been involved a lot with FEMA remapping initiatives, as well as helping communities understand their risk to flooding due to storm surge and sea level rise. I can get rid of some of this. Okay. So today I am going to speak to you about this project. I'm going to give you the overview and the goals. And as a spoiler, we do not have results yet for this project. So you will not be seeing yet the areas that are at risk. So I'm going to be speaking about how we will be doing this analysis, what data we're using, an example of an output that we could get, next steps for this project, and I'll talk about a similar project that I've worked on in Maine. So as an overview, what is this? This is a citywide flood vulnerability analysis. We will be looking at flooding due to storm surge, sea level rise, and extreme river flows, because Bath is on a river. Why are we doing this? As the Maine Climate Council would say, Maine won't wait. We want to take initiative with the city of Bath and have input on what we want the future to look like, knowing that flooding is out there. How are we doing this? As Ruth mentioned, the city of Bath was awarded a community action grant from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, or GOPIF for short. And we will also be doing a lot of modeling. So the goals for the project, in the simplest terms, we want to know what will flood and when it will flood. That's our basic question. So we want to figure out which streets, which buildings, which streetlights, which bridges, which parks, everything we see out there in the city, we want to know when, if it will hit flooding, and when that will be. So we're looking at 3 time horizons. We're looking at right now, 2050 and 2100. And the reason that we're doing this, and if there's one part about this presentation that I want you to know, it is this next piece, because I'm about to jump into this technical modeling, which I'm very passionate about, but it is technical. I try to make it as interesting as possible, but it's easy to lose people. So before I lose anybody, the reason that we're doing this is so that we can help shape what we want the city of Bath to look like in the future. Knowing that flooding is going to come, when we know where the flooding is going to come, how much flooding there will be, how deep it will be, how long something will be flooded for, we can start planning for that. And we can avoid reactionary engineering, which is always catching up, having a road be damaged, being washed out, a building be damaged, and then just repairing. So instead of reacting to what will happen, we can plan for that. That is the essence of this. And in order to do this, we have to do this modeling. Okay, so the vulnerability analysis. What makes something vulnerable? There are three pieces to this that we look at. The first is the exposure to flooding. Is an area likely to be flooded? Will it get wet? So that is when you look at a map that shows flood extents, that is what we're capturing there. What is exposed to the water? The second is sensitivity to flooding. So if it does get wet, will it be damaged? Something that may not be sensitive to flooding is a road. Roads can be flooded, usually, if there isn't a lot of wave action, they can experience floodwater, not be damaged, and we will move on. Electrical equipment, some of that cannot get wet at all. It will immediately be damaged. So we think about that when we start thinking about what we want to prioritize for adaptation. And the third is adaptive capacity. So how easy will it be for a piece of infrastructure to adapt to flooding? Will it be raising a certain road by 1/2 foot in elevation, or will it be completely relocating a pump station that exists? So there are various levels of how easy it will be to adapt. Those three things, exposure to flooding, sensitivity to flooding, adaptive capacity, are all taken into consideration when we figure out what is the most vulnerable and what isn't as vulnerable, but we may not need to focus on yet. So let's look at Bath in the greater scheme of things. Here is a map of southern mid-coast Maine. Bath is lightly outlined in red. The northern part of it is in Merrymeeting Bay, and then downtown areas on the Kennebec River. We have two rivers coming into Merrymeeting Bay. We have the Androscoggin River, and then it is cut off, but we also have the Kennebec River, as you all likely know. They join together in Merrymeeting Bay and then continue as the Kennebec River downstream before discharging into the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, we have tides from the ocean that propagate upstream and affect the city of Bath. And so when we look at the flooding, we need to look at both of these, both rivers and the ocean, when we want to capture what will be happening. So the way that we are doing this is by creating a two-dimensional hydraulic model in a program called HECRAS. I have here an image of the outline of the model boundaries. So we are including riverine flows, we have tidal flows. The other things that we need to create a model, we need to understand the elevation of the land, the topographic data, the bathymetric data, which is the elevation of the land below water. So we combine those to get a surface of what our earth looks like here. We include land cover data. So that would be which area is pavement, which area is field, which area is a forest, because as water flows over those areas, it flows differently. It will move very fast on pavement. It will move much slower through a forest. We take that into consideration, as well as our water inputs, those river inputs and that tidal input. So here's a fun picture of our elevation surface for the model. So this is our topographic data. This was taken, this was compiled using LiDAR data that was flown in 2020, so very recent. And then as well as bathymetric data available from NOAA. And I've zoomed in here so you can see just right downtown. We've included the buildings in the model because we do expect that some flooding will encroach upon the buildings, and we want to see how those buildings will, how that water will flow around the buildings. So here's the detail. And now to go back, I talked about our topography, and now we need to think about for our model where we're getting this water data from. So we have the rivers and we have the tides. And an amazing thing happened right before I started this project, which is that coincidentally, a water level data collector was installed at the Maine Maritime Museum, which collects the elevation of the water every 6 minutes. This was installed in November, and it has been so helpful for this project. So I just have here a little, it shows where the data was collected on this map. And then I'm just showing what the type of data we can get, so you can see how this is affected by the tides. I think I took this screenshot yesterday. So this would be the tides that we saw yesterday. It was installed in November, so it was there. If you remember, on December 23rd, we had a major coastal storm event. It was there for that. So we were able to get the water levels during that storm and see what storm water levels in the river look like, which is very helpful. Now for the rivers, USGS has a series of gauges on rivers across the United States. There are several gauges along the Androscoggin and the Kennebec rivers where we can collect stream flow data. I just have some examples here. I actually pulled the stream flow measurements from that December 23rd storm period. You can see it really spikes in stream flow because this wasn't just a coastal event. It was also a major precipitation event and a major riverine event. So just to highlight again that when we look at Bath, we really want to capture those river flows and the tidal flows. So here's that storm. This is a picture that the Bath Fire and Rescue Department put on their Facebook page for the Kennebec Tavern. I'm not sure if this was like right at the peak of the storm, but you can see there's quite a bit of flooding. And since I have that data and I'm working on this model, I wanted to do a run of this known storm that we had to see how the model responds. So that's what I did. So here's a little capture of model results. We have the Kennebec Tavern here, and you can see that there's flooding. The model is predicting flooding to extend along Commercial Street. And I want to just highlight some of the data we can get from this model. So in addition to the extent of flooding, we can also get at any given point. So I have this little pink point, it's hard to see. We can get data such as the depth. So you can see it goes up to a little over a foot deep, but also we can get the duration of flooding. So this is showing, you can't see it here, but I've looked at the actual values. It is showing that that area, that section of the road was flooded for about 1 hour during the peak of the storm. And then it was flooded again later on when the tide came up again. But we can use that information when we talk about adaptation, when we look at results for future storms for sea level rise. We can see if a section of road is flooded, if it's just flooded for 10 minutes during the peak of a storm, or if we're expected to have it inundated for hours. And that will help us plan, do some emergency action planning for the city of Bath. Okay, so sea level rise. I keep mentioning sea level rise. So we will be including sea level rise when we look at our future scenarios for flooding in 2050 and flooding in 2100. The Maine Climate Council is recommending values based on some NOAA sea level rise scenarios. So here I have graphed from years 2000 2100. Very small in the corner, hard to see. For the first 20 years of this century, I have the monthly mean sea level from the Portland, Maine tide gauge. And then from there, we have these sea level rise rates, the intermediate low, intermediate high, and high. The Maine Climate Council has recommended to communities in Maine that they commit to managing for the intermediate level of sea level rise. So that would be 1.5 feet of sea level rise in 2050 and 3.9 feet by 2100. However, they have also said that communities should be prepared to manage for that high rate of sea level rise, which would be 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. Yeah, it's a lot. It is a lot. That is a lot. And I like to say 2100 is as we get further right on this graph, the numbers are a little more unknown. There's a bigger error bar. So we have that 8.8 feet in mind, but we are not going to recommend that the city of Bath start making decisions based on what flooding would look like under that scenario. It is helpful to see big picture, but it is not something that we're actually following yet. But as I will say, when we think about adaptation, we like to plan our projects so that they can be adapted a little bit over time, so that you're not building a pier to 20 feet in elevation right away, you're building it to 12 feet, and then knowing in 20 years, you might add a couple more feet. So we add on as we go. Okay, so the next steps for this project is actually to do those model runs. So I showed you one model run for that December storm. We still need to do all of the other model runs. So we're looking at 3 time horizons, like I said, present day, 2050, 2100. And for each of those time horizons, we want to look at the average daily tide. So what will average tides look like in 2100? We also want to look at tidal storm events. So the 100-year storm from that tidal propagation. And then thirdly, we want to look at a combination of the 100-year tidal event plus 100-year river flows. And then we are also for the future timeframes estimating increased riverine flows so the 100-year riverine flow today may be increased in 2100 due to increased precipitation events. The science around how river flows will change in the future is much more unknown, but for the purposes of this study, we're going to consider that they will be increased. So in total, we'll have 15 different modeling scenarios that we will be evaluating. So there will be 15 different maps created, 15 different, if you look at a piece of a section of road, 15 different scenarios under which it may or may not be flooded. And we will use that information as part of our vulnerability analysis and as part of our recommendations for what we should adapt and when. So in speaking about, infrastructure and areas that the city should focus on, we've started compiling a GIS database of the assets for the city. So just for example, this is some of the transportation data that we've collected. We have streets, bus lines, bridges, railroads, we have sidewalks, we have school bus routes, we have building data. So most of the buildings that exist, maybe not brand new buildings, but most of the buildings in Bath, we can figure out what are residential buildings, what are commercial buildings. We can figure out what buildings are very important to the community. That might be the library. It could be City Hall. It could be a soup kitchen. So we'll think about all of those buildings. We've highlighted schools and daycare facilities, public safety buildings such as police stations and the fire department. We're also looking at public space data. And I want to say I'm zoomed in to downtown here. We're doing a study for the entirety of Bath, but it is hard to really see the details of that when I show the whole city. So I apologize, we are looking everywhere. There is a lot of public space data that is not just right downtown, but we want to include wetlands, trails, parks, playgrounds. We're really trying to capture a comprehensive data set for the city. So once we have our modeling results, we have that data set, we can see what is flooded when, what is sensitive to flooding, what has a high or low adaptive capacity. We can start recommending strategies and timelines for the city to adapt their infrastructure. Adaptation might be to elevate a road. It could be to retreat or relocate a road. It could be fortify, maybe adding a seawall in. It could be doing nothing. Maybe it's not a critical piece of infrastructure. Perhaps it's a waterfront park and we're okay with it flooding. So we're recommending strategies and when those should be in place. Immediately, 2050, 2100 or beyond. And this will help provide the city with a path forward. And then I'm just going to talk about a quick example. So I did a very similar project for the town of Stonington. And this is an example of the kind of information they get that the city of Bath can expect to at the end of this project. So this is a table of 15 or so roads in the city of Bath, and they're prioritized, higher priority in terms of adaptation to lower priority. So if we look at this highest priority road, Oceanville Road, there's approximately 100 businesses or residences for which this road is the sole access. And there's also no detour available. This is the only way to get there. And this road is expected to experience flooding during a 10-year storm in the year 2030 and during highest annual tide in 2050. So there are other roads that will experience flooding in a similar timeline, but there might be an alternate way to get to those places. So I'm just highlighting, we really think about all aspects of this so that the city can have a clear path forward, and the city of Bath will get information like this at the end of this project as well. So as I've mentioned, we're currently in the middle of the vulnerability analysis. This is our first community presentation. We expect to have the model results finished by the end of spring or early summer, and then we'll have another community presentation and we'll wrap up the project and our recommendations likely this fall. This project definitely will be done by the end of this year because that's the grant deadline, but since the city of Bath is getting a GIS intern this summer, we are going to take advantage of that and work with that person to solidify our GIS database for this project. And that's all I have. So I welcome any questions. Yes.
Tell me, are you working with Bath Iron Works at all in this project?
Great question. Before this project began, I was in touch with Bath Iron Works about whether they had water level data. This was before the whole new water level data gauge was installed. Since then, I personally have not been in touch. I know that Rod Melanson, who is unfortunately not able to be with us today, has been in touch with them. And our goal is once we have these results, because in my preliminary look at the results, Bath Iron Works is very heavily affected by flooding. So when we have these results, the next piece of this will be stakeholder engagement and working on what we do next. And so definitely one of our goals is to work with Bath Iron Works.
What was their reaction, initial reaction
So when I reached out to them, it was just for data collection and they were very helpful. But I have not had conversations with them since.
Seems to me the Department of Defense would be interested in it as well.
Yeah. I was just going to make a quick comment that I believe Rob would probably have more intel on that. On that development, as I know they have some of their own plans that they're already working on, being that the Department of Defense, so there'll be more to come on that, I'm sure.
I guess, I don't know if it would make sense to ask if anyone in this room knows, but there has been that outreach to Bath Iron Works, but if anyone knows of a good contact there, and has any recommendations, that would be helpful too. Yeah.
In the 100-year column, I noted that most vulnerable road was, I think, mean high water, probably the abbreviation, but so I'm imagining in that scenario, the vegetation along your coast is going to change, not just like roads flooding, but like your park would be not only flooding periodically, but turning into marsh, or I'm imagining that there will be like ecosystem level changes.
Definitely, yes. Yes, and we will be looking at potential marsh migration as part of this project. And that is one thing that's, you have to keep in mind when you do these models for 2100 is by the time, say we do have 8.8 feet of sea level rise, by the time we get to 2100, we will have had to make changes with our existing infrastructure. So when we model it how it is right now, it isn't what it will look like then if we have that amount of sea level rise. I've included some culverts, some low-lying bridges, which will likely need to be upsized or they'll be just unusable by the time we get there. So yes, marsh migration, ecosystem changes, definitely we should expect. And also just that caveat for those 100-year, that 2100 timeframe, things will have changed before we get there. Yes.
This is, I guess, a little bit of a technical question, but we know one of the impacts of climate change is going to be more frequent and more intense storms. When you're looking out to 2050 and 2100, do you have a different definition for what a 100-year storm will be than it is now?
That is an excellent question. The modeling that is required to come up with still water elevations during storm events. So that is just, if we have a 100-year event coming, the elevation of the ocean increases due to high offshore winds that are pushing the water up, and also a decrease in barometric pressure, which you can imagine is like sucking up the water, is how I like to think about it. So that just raises our water surface. That doesn't include waves or anything. We just have a higher surge elevation. And the modeling that is required to come up with that higher elevation is very advanced. There are scientists that do statistical analysis with thousands of storms that start as a little speck off the coast of Africa and then come around the United States. And after you do those thousands of storms, you can get an idea of what water levels will be. Those will be changing because the 100-year storm today is going to be a bigger 100-year storm in the future. So figuring that out was beyond the scope of this study, but that is, yes, that is very important. It is one of the biggest faults of FEMA is they base a lot of their information on hindcast data. They don't include sea level rise, so we're not getting are the biggest risk that we might see. So all of this is a caveat of things can always be refined more and more. And then I will say that with the riverine flows, with those increased precipitation events, it doesn't always necessarily translate to increased river flows. It might be a quick increase in river flows, but also something that we're expecting to happen in the future is for temperatures to increase. And when temperatures increase, river flows decrease. But when precipitation increases, river flows can increase. So it's a complexity that we have yet to really understand. There have been some studies on river basins in Maine that have shown it could be an increase of 40%, a decrease of 40%, depending on if there's a higher temperature increase, higher precipitation increase. So we try to take the latest available science and incorporate that into our modeling. But one thing that I love about projects like this is the city will have this model. And as we get updated information in the future, we can update the model. We can put in those new values for storms. Yes.
So what we saw on December 23rd, is that considered, I'm certain it's not a 100-year event, but is that every 2 or 3 years or a 5-year event or a 10-year event? And then if we're planning for 1.5 feet higher than that by, I think that was the 2050 number, is it 1.5 feet higher than that, or is it 1.5 feet higher than something else?
Great question.
We might anticipate.
Yeah, so that December 23rd event was almost the highest storm surge seen at the NOAA Portland tide gauge since it was installed, which is, yeah, it's a pretty big deal. That, it might have affected, it might not have been the highest storm surge that the city of Bath has seen. And it wasn't the highest in Portland, it was almost the highest. So yes, that was not necessarily a 100-year event, but as we just talked about, the 100-year event is a little wishy-washy. So it's actually in any given year, the way that you think about it statistically is that there's a 1% chance of that event happening in any given year. So in 100 years, perhaps you would see that once, but that isn't quite how statistics works. But that's where that 100-year storm comes from. That, as we had just talked about, is probably going to change. But when we think about sea level rise, yes, what we're doing for this study is taking what the predicted 100-year storm surge level is in the Kennebec River and adding 1.5 feet of sea level rise to that, and then propagating that up the river in the tidal. So we'll look at the full tides, and what I mentioned before about having those storm tides available from that water level data near the Maritime Museum. When a storm comes in, it often comes in over a couple of days. So the tides start getting higher, and then they peak, and then they'll get lower and lower. So we can take that shape of how it really builds up and sets back down and scale that for what we expect to happen with sea level rise. So that peak in December 23rd was not quite a 100-year event in terms of the 100-year event that we will be modeling for the city. It will be a little bit higher than that.
We have a Zoom question.
Sure.
This is from a middle school student. If we wait to react instead of planning ahead, what might be some of the consequences for future generations?
Great question. If we wait to react instead of planning ahead, then future generations will be unable to live in the city that the community members of today envisioned and hoped for. So if we enjoy our waterfront parks and our trails by the water, and we don't want to have big seawalls blocking our view and causing erosion along the river, then we will need to plan today for our future generations. They will be missing out on what we love about the city of Bath now. In the back.
So I wonder if you can envision what is happening on the West Coast with an incomprehensible amount of moisture. Did they have a set of prognostication or prognosticators that would have led to understanding what they have now, and then relate that to any unpredictable phenomena here on the East Coast?
Okay, I'm gonna rephrase that to make sure I got that right. So California is what I think you're talking about. California right now is experiencing extreme rain events. And they have actually for the last several months. It is causing landslides, major flooding, dams are at their brink. And it is this extreme phenomenon that can happen out there. And so I believe your question is, would they have been able to predict this? And is there something that could happen to us that similar to that we should be able to predict? Oh, it's a hard one. From my understanding about the West Coast, there is a phenomena that happens in what they call the atmospheric ocean that I believe, maybe not across the entire globe, but at least for the United States, I believe is specific to the West Coast. Could that happen here? I have read about, and I hesitate to say this because nobody quote me on this. I have read about phenomena that could happen on the East Coast due to warming water temperatures, due to warming airs, where the Gulf Stream reverses. Maybe somebody else has read about this too.
Yes.
And if the Gulf Stream were to reverse and we didn't have that, currently it comes up past Maine and it circles around and goes back down by the UK. The UK, even though it is a similar latitude to us, has completely different weather pattern there. And a lot of that is because of the Gulf Stream. If the Gulf Stream were to reverse, I think there would be major consequences. I don't know specifically what those would be, but when we're talking about what is possible with climate change, I think there is a lot of unknown still, definitely. Yes.
Then I'm very encouraged that you're working with the Maine Climate Council and their recommendations for us to move away from carbon as quickly as we can. And that there are measures that all of us as homeowners and drivers can take. And how do those recommendations fit into your modeling? And do you model with the potential adaptability that we all can make in this mid-coast area? And how does that affect, though, the greater climate that we're subjected to?
Yes, I'm going to move back. Actually, I'm going to go to a new slide that I haven't shown you yet. I put it in there just in case this came up. The Maine Climate Council is using the sea level rise recommendations that are from NOAA, which are based on the carbon emissions and what carbon emissions might be. So higher carbon emissions will lead to this higher rate of sea level rise. Lower carbon emissions, a lower rate of sea level rise. I want to highlight this slide right now. So this is the NOAA monthly water levels for the last 20 years at the Portland tide gauge. So that's the dark blue line that's going up and down. On top of that, I have the projected rates of sea level rise from NOAA starting in the year 2000. I just want to point out that at any given month, the highest mean tide could be much higher than the highest predicted rate of sea level rise, and the lowest could be much lower than the lowest rate of sea level rise. So all of this to say, when we think about adaptation in our city and our infrastructure, we want to work with what we think might be happening. So we can plan for the highest rate of sea level rise, and then there might be a month when our water is higher than that. So it's part of the planning process. Did you have something like that? Yeah.
Throw in a question there. Is it because they're extrapolating with, they're looking for an average low in the future or an average high or something like that, or an average intermediate, rather than we're looking for individual data points of like an event, right?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So of the tide, are in the future, are we looking at the average tide as opposed to a peak? So this is the over a month. This is the average over 1 month of time. So it is a little bit average. It is not the average over an entire year, for example. But even if there are certain days where the water is higher due to little storms that come, that's something that we want to be able to adapt to. We want our infrastructure to not be vulnerable. We want our people to not be vulnerable. We don't want there to be neighborhoods that are abandoned because you can't get to them because there's one road that gets to them and that gets flooded and we haven't put attention on that road. So we want to, it's equality, really. We want to look at the citizens of Bath, the infrastructure, and think about how we want everything to look in the future. Yes.
I'm thinking about our neighbors, and I'm thinking about other towns all over Maine that have waterfront. Is every town gonna need to do this kind of study, or can we learn from each other? Because it's massive, and we're lucky in Bath that we've been able to have you guys come in.
Yeah, so I think about that a lot. I definitely, as I've done more of these projects, I am trying to streamline a framework so that it can be used by other communities. We are creating a new model for the city of Bath for this project, and that might not be attainable by other municipalities in the state. So I have a couple of things to say about that. One is the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future has been amazing in giving out grants for this type of work. So spread the word to neighboring municipalities. I actually don't know of a municipality that was denied funding. So, and that's what funded this project. The other thing is there are some initiatives currently to do a statewide model. There is one in development. I can't speak on how refined that model would be, for the city of Bath. Is it really capturing the detail of downtown? It could be something where this new statewide model is created and a municipality could then refine it further. So not do all of the work required, but just add in some more work to say, hey, we really want to look at our downtown area. And we use this existing model, which is great. And I know there are some communities that are teaming up together, some of the smaller communities. Brooksville, Blue Hill, and Surrey all got grants to do this type of work, and they're teaming up to do one major project, which is great. A lot of communities in Maine don't have the staff to manage a project like this, so it helps when they team up. Yeah.
Yeah. When all is said and done, are you gonna be able to make specific recommendations about fortification or retreat or
Mhm.
whatever the other options are?
Yes,
You are.
that is the goal. So that is the end game, is that we will be able to look at specific pieces of infrastructure and say, here are 3 things you could do. You could elevate, you could put up a seawall, you could do nothing. Here's what we recommend that you do. And here's how much you may need to elevate this piece of infrastructure by, and we suggest you do that by 2050. We really want the city of Bath to have a product that they can take, that they can use to get more funding, to say, hey, look, we've done this work, we know what we need to do. We want the funds now to actually do these projects. Yes.
Looking at your graph here, it's obvious that sea level is rising and you have data for Stonington. What have they decided to do over there? Can you share that with us?
Yes, I have really enjoyed working with Stonington over the years. Kathleen is their town manager there. She is a go-getter. She said to me that, you know, when she doesn't work there anymore, she just wants to make sure she doesn't screw anything up with the town. And so they immediately started doing design plans for their fish pier. And I believe that has been reconstructed. So that was based on our vulnerability study. And I believe that they are well on their way to addressing these roads. Some of them, a little bit of a challenge. Some of those roads are state-owned roads. They wanted to include them in the study and then say, go to the state and say, we need you, we need you here. So yes, they are definitely making headway. Mhm.
Including like their sewers and electricity, which are the 2 key, and of course the water.
Yeah, so we've focused primarily on roads for the town of Stonington. We did also look at pump stations, and they do have a sewer outfall there that we recommended to do a more detailed study on, but that is on their focus, but the primary focus was their streets.
And is the solution affordable by the taxpayers?
I can't speak to that. I just am not aware enough of municipal spending. However, I will say that a lot of these projects can be funded through state and federal grants. And that's definitely what the town of Stonington does. And that is what, when we do these projects, we really want to gear the municipality up to get that grant, those further grants to help fund these projects.
Does the Inflation Reduction Act have specific funding available for these sorts of whatever adaptation measures that need to happen?
I don't know the answer to that specifically. I don't know. Mhm.
Following up on the question about what actions can we take, will this study inform only actions regarding city infrastructure, or will it also inform private landowners about what their choices may be?
Yeah, so this study will be comprehensive in that we will look at private land residences and the impact, the number of houses, which houses may be impacted under what scenarios. And we are planning on providing guidance to homeowners on what they can do to flood-proof, to adapt their infrastructure. Yeah, you have your hand up, yes.
So looking at these numbers for intermediate and high, and on one of your slides, I think showed the amount of water that could inundate the area. We already know it comes in cheap. I just came from the Kennebec Tavern. I was telling my friend this was underwater a few months ago. But my question is, I'm imagining that one possibility is that our downtown is going to be looking totally different, and that can we really keep back all that water from inundating further into the town? So
Mhm.
some of these buildings may no longer be able to be where they are, right?
Yes, well, I will say the most extreme event we're looking at is a 100-year storm tide, which is a little over 8 feet above, roughly above the mean sea level, plus 8.8 feet of sea level rise, plus major river flows with increase. So I actually have run that model, and I specifically chose not to show the results. I think about, if these slides are shared with people that didn't attend the meeting, and then you just see this map. I need to provide many caveats before you look at this image. It does show a lot of flooding. I will say City Hall is like on its own little hill protected, but all around it is flooded. But as I said, that event is the most extreme and not something you should start planning for. It is helpful to see that image and to think, if something were to happen to City Hall, there was a major fire, then you could say, maybe now is the opportunity to think about a new location for this building. It's not something that we need to decide on now. I do think that we will see there are low-lying areas that are expected to be flooded in 2050, but I don't believe it will be a major section of downtown outside from that 8.8 feet of sea level rise major storm. That does show quite a bit of flooding. That's just information to keep in the back of our mind.
So when, let's say something happens to a building and you're renovating for any reason, or the owner just wants to renovate. Is this already happened? I don't think it does, so you can just tell me, but when you go get your codes approved, is there like a new level of code that you can pass to be climate resilient?
So each municipality can set up their own rules and regulations around it. And that actually might be an outcome from a study like this, maybe not immediately, but maybe in the future, the city of Bath says we're going to create an ordinance that uses these flood layers, and houses that are within it need to do a couple extra measures. Without that, how it stands right now in terms of FEMA, for example, if you're in a FEMA flood zone, if you're in a FEMA specific VE flood zone, a velocity zone, then and you want to renovate your house, you cannot renovate it more than 50% of its worth without elevating it above that flood elevation. So there are some regulations in place that the federal government, that FEMA has tried to make. If you want to get more in depth than that, as I said, FEMA doesn't include sea level rise. A lot of FEMA's maps are actually quite inaccurate just because they don't have the capability to really do detailed studies, especially in somewhere like Maine that has an intense coastline. So a lot of municipalities have come up with more strict rules than that. That might be something that the city wants to do. Is put in, if you're going to renovate, you need to elevate your heat equipment, your electrical equipment, use flood-proofing materials, etc.
And
The
can I
first
just-
step
I was just
in
gonna,
putting together guidelines like that would be your study to understand where such guidelines might be needed.
Yes, yeah.
well, I was gonna add from the city side of this, We also have a consultant, Camaris is doing work for us on zoning update. And they are, I think, trying to talk to you and also the comprehensive plan update. So we've got like 3 pieces going on that everybody's talking, as far as I understand. It's a great question.
We got another Zoom question.
Sure.
To what extent will your study influence local government decisions related to adaptive strategies on the short term? For example, the city of Augusta has prioritized the building of a seawall to protect the downtown area on the riverfront. Our city has prioritized over the last several years the building of a boardwalk at a cost of well over $1 million. The December 23rd event completely flooded that boardwalk, which will have a negative impact on its viability. Given your study, it would seem that the city should be looking at options related to climate change issues and challenges, rather than a boardwalk that may only last a few more years if we continue to have a repeat of December 23rd events.
We will definitely be looking at short-term risk, short-term vulnerability. So anything that is, if our modeling shows that that boardwalk infrastructure is exposed to flooding and sensitive to flooding, then that might be a priority that we say the city should look at sooner than later. So that we're going to take into consideration most infrastructure in the city of Bath. I also will say that in the short term, we want to be practical. So some of the recommendations that we will make will just be temporary measures. So it might be, this road is expected to flood, or this boardwalk, or this building, maybe not a building, let's stick with a road, is expected to flood for a short amount of time during these storm events. However, there's a lot of other infrastructure which we want you to focus on. So what we suggest that you do is know that you're going to put temporary roadblocks out on that road when a storm comes. And that's what you're going to do for the next 20 years while you allocate funds, apply for grant funding so that you can address that road. You can't do everything. You just simply cannot do everything at once. We want to be able to build off of things. So that temporary measure will be in place for 10 or 15 years. You just know that when a storm event comes, you put those roadblocks out, but then we can address it. We can elevate it. We can do what we need to do. Yeah.
Will your study include vulnerability of public sewer, public water, wellheads and septic systems where they exist in that?
So there is an existing vulnerability study for the storm and sewer district. So that is not explicitly included in this study, but we are including things like, if there are private sewers, we should include that. We should include that data. So that's something that I will work with the GIS intern that we get, because we are including things like brownfield sites, contaminated areas, the landfill, because if those areas get flooded or inundated, that can actually affect, there could be ramifications of that we want to be aware of. So things like that will definitely be included. And so if there are private sewers, we should include that as well. Yes.
I was just looking at that, if you look at the highest thing and you start looking at the geography around Brunswick and so on, at the highest rate, it's likely that Androscoggin may change its course. And so I think calculating what the event of the highest risk is, the river flows and so on, gets way beyond anyone's.
Yes,
And same thing with, you know, I think, Pittsburgh and Popham are going to be, the Kennebec is going to change its direction, so I think that's gonna be a really way beyond any simple modeling.
anything that we can, yeah, easily predict, definitely. You know, we don't have this situation, but I think about I think it is just called the LA River, that doesn't always meet the ocean. There's not always enough water in it for it to meet the ocean. But now they have this major rain event. So the fluctuation, the change is beyond what we can imagine. We're a little more stable in Maine with our weather events. It's one reason I feel very lucky to live in this state. We are not subject to the type of extreme storms and disasters that the rest of the country is, but sea level rise really is an issue here. And this isn't something that we're studying, but I have spoken about it, you know, with Rod and with the group, is heat. Heat is something that we really need to take into consideration for our health and safety. Our old homes are not equipped with central air. Usually new construction could be. Our population is older and we're just not accustomed to the type of heat in the summer that we have been seeing. So that is one of, along with sea level rise and coastal storms, that is another danger, climate danger to our state.
And we older are in good shape.
Yes, I strive to be in great shape when I'm old too. Yes.
I feel like seawalls famously fail on the exposed coast. Are they effective in a sort of inland scenario?
Yeah, so there are definitely a time and a place for a seawall. We now, you know, I am a civil engineer, so by nature, my line of work is the built environment, but it's shifting. It is shifting to be not such the built environment, but, you know, working with the environment that exists. So we are doing a lot of work with living shorelines. So our staff in our office in Portland were involved with the pilot study for the living shorelines for the state. There was a pilot study because it is not an officially recognized measure for protecting the shoreline, but we want it to be. So Pete Slavinsky was really, if you don't know Pete, he is heavily involved in sea level rise. He's a geologist for Maine Geological Survey. He's done a lot of this work up and down the coast. So he really wanted to do more work with living shorelines. So we've done this pilot study. We did projects. I actually have images at the end of this in 3 different towns, 3 different locations. Here we are building some living shorelines with bags of oyster shells. And Pete's out there helping with some volunteers. I was not there. So yes, there's a time and place for sea level walls. There's also a big opportunity for things like living shorelines, especially in marshy areas that we may see on the shoreline of Bath, places that may start to experience erosion that might not have already, places that don't have extreme wave action. Then these are areas where we can work with vegetation to help secure that shoreline. And that is definitely the avenue that we choose to take.
So what did the study show?
So this, I believe, was put in last year. or 2 years ago. People are wearing masks, so it's definitely within the last couple of years. And I think it's still a study in progress. So far, it's held up. I'm not sure the timeline of the project, but I think the goal of having this be recognized by the state is really easily permittable is what we want for these projects, so that we can recommend these projects and have them be permitted by the state and then constructed. We're still on that goal. It's not lost.
Eat more oysters.
It looks like we're just about done with questions. Leila, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
It passed around a sign-up sheet for Bath Climate Action Commission emails. We don't really have a formal structure of emailing yet, but as we build up our capacity over the next year or two, we will be reaching out more. So you're not going to get very regular emails from us, but as we have programs, we'll try to send out emails to this list to give you a heads up. I think future climate conversation programs are looking to focus on ways that people can update their homes, options for solar, options for electric vehicles, and having more conversations about that. So we really appreciate everybody coming tonight, and thank you.
Is there another program scheduled?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But within the next 2 months, we're hoping to have another one. And we're really looking forward to Leila's presentation in the summer of the final results. Thank you.